a little bit about her background first. She was born in Wisconsin to actually a Wisconsin state senator, and her mother was an Italian coloratura. So she had music in the home from an early age. In 1962, she earned a master's degree in composition at Louisiana State University. And really pertinent for us, she actually pursued postgraduate studies with Otto Luening and Jack Beeson at Columbia University. So she actually was at Columbia, a while ago in the 60s with those guys. Then in 1969, she moved to Munich, Germany, where she became a full-time resident. I'm not quite 100% sure why this is, why she ended up, being born in Wisconsin, then going to Louisiana, then going to New York, then going to Munich. I'm not entirely sure yet because I haven't really spoken to her about, this trajectory. But she's been in Munich since 1969 and hasn't left since. And then again, another pertinent thing for us here at Columbia, from 1971 to 83, she produced the German-American contemporary concerts in Munich, which received support from our famous Ditzen Fund, which is still being used today. So a couple of things I didn't know about her before I discovered this piece, that she actually was pretty heavily involved with Columbia University back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Okay. For some reason, I'm having trouble using the arrows here. Okay, but we'll see how it goes. And then in 1973, she composed her, probably her most well-known work, especially in Germany, the Symphony No. 1, Music on Open Strings. And then, as I mentioned, in 1984, and then revised 1989, she composed the Fourth Symphony, which I'm going to talk about in this presentation. Which also should be important to note that, as you can see in this next bullet point here, she composed a lot of symphonies. She's written 16 symphonies, which makes her probably the most, or if not the most prolific female symphonist. And even more importantly, I would say she is definitely one of the most prolific symphonists, period, in the 20th and 21st centuries. I was trying to look up other symphonists like William Schumann or Roy Harris or David Diamond or people like that. And I mean, she has just as many symphonies, if not more, than a lot of those composers that we think of as our, American symphonists. And as I said before, she continues to compose and reside here in Munich. And a little bit about the subtitle of the work, Chiaroscuro. It's a term from the Italian compound chiaro and scuro. And those words mean light, clear, and dark, respectively. And they're used to refer to the distribution of light and dark tones with which a painter in the visual arts could imitate light and shadow. So if we look at these two examples here, we have Leonardo da Vinci's Virgin and Child with Saint Anne and John the Baptist, which was sketched in 1500. And then you have another example 100 years later, and both during the Renaissance, by Caravaggio, The Calling of Saint Matthew. And we could see here that both these paintings are obviously done with different mediums. The one on the left, the Da Vinci, is a sketch, a pencil sketch, whereas the one on the right is this oil painting. But we could see with the gradations of light and dark that both artists are able to create this kind of depth. And you cannot have this amount of depth without both the light and the dark, without both the chiaro and the scuro. So to me, how does this relate to the Coates? To me, this creates a sense of depth also in the music, especially in terms of emotional depth. And for me, the chiaro elements in the piece have to do with tonality, and then the scuro elements have to do with microtonality. And in the piece, there are lots of things that have to do with tonality, like paraphrase or use of melody, the use of harmony. And then as far as the microtonality portion of the scuro element, we have glissandi and a lot of cluster type chords. So to me, you really need both these elements, chiaro and the scuro, to create this kind of the kind of depth that Gloria Coates is looking for in this Fourth Symphony. Okay. So moving on to the form map here, we can observe that there are three movements that comprise the entire symphony. We have the first movement, illumination. Then we have the second movement, mystical plosives. and the third movement, the dream sequence. So very colorful titles for each of these movements. So for a global sense for how the symphony fits, or rather doesn't fit within the continuum of traditional symphonic practice, there are three main contrasts that I want to draw your attention to before diving any further into this map. And by the way, you should have this map on your own. So when we go on to other slides, you should be able to see the map in your handout that I put in that Nina put in the folder yesterday. It also has a couple of articles that I'm going to refer to in this handout. So when we move on to other slides, it will be easy to see what we're referring to with the handout. So the three things I want to draw your attention to as far as how this relates to the continuum of traditional symphonic practice are number one, there are three movements instead of the four movements that became standardized with the advent of the mid to late Haydn symphonies, that became even more standardized with people like Mozart and Beethoven. So that's number one. Number two, all the tempi of these movements are actually relatively similar, with the first two movements being BPM of 60, okay, while the third movement is slightly faster at a quarter note equals 76. So I did a little bit more investigative work about this actually, because if you take into account the time that each measure takes to elapse, the third movement is actually even more similar in tempo than the BPM might indicate, because the first two movements are completely in 4/4 time, while the third movement is in 5/4 time. So if we did a little math, we can see that each measure in each of these movements span basically 4 seconds. Now compare this to the traditional continuum of symphonic practice. In the relatively few symphonies that are in three movements, usually the first and the third movements are in this brisk tempo, while the middle movement is much slower. So it's quite different in this respect as well. Now, the final point I want to make about how this relates to the continuum of traditional symphonic practice is probably the most important, and that is the general mood of all three movements are also quite similar. So there are, in all three of these movements, there are moments of like abject melancholy, glimmers of hope, bombastic outbursts, and anxiety-ridden stillness. And compare this to a traditional symphony, and we could observe that all four movements are typically quite different in character, seeking to achieve contrast from one movement to the next. So to highlight this similarity of mood between all three movements, I want to play you the first 10 seconds of each movement, followed by the last 10 seconds of each movement. So in the first 10 seconds of each of these three movements, you'll notice that they all begin with this very soft, haunting, rather anxiety-inducing hell note. So here's the first 10 seconds of the illumination. Okay, if it plays, 1 second. Okay. And here's the first 10 seconds of the mystical plosives. And then finally, the first 10 seconds of the dream sequence. And now turning to the last moments of these movements, they all showcase something entirely different. The orchestra playing these tutti fortissimo, rather bombastic licks. So here is the last 10 seconds of the first movement. The last 10 seconds of the second movement. And the last 10 seconds of the third movement. So one last general comparison I want to make is that they all are built on this C fundamental pitch, with the outer movements forming a cluster chord in the upper voices above C, while the middle movement here only sounds the C's in octaves. So throughout the entire piece, and I'll point this out, we'll see that the pitch C actually serves as a harmonic anchor for many moments of the symphony. Though I want to just say, just as importantly, it does not serve as a pitch center, as is often the case with referring to melodies in terms of the functional tonal aspect, and even as far as to say serialized music. Okay. Now, my presentation will focus much of its analysis on the first movement over here at the top, illumination. Okay. However, before analyzing prescient sections of that movement in depth, I would like to demonstrate what is happening in each of these movements on a macro level. So beginning from movement 1, there are 5 distinct layers of saliency. So starting from the bottom layer down here, we can observe an omnipresent bass line that is passed around throughout the orchestra for the duration of the 11-minute movement. So this, in fact, is a paraphrase of the Passacaglia from Henry Purcell's Dido's Lament, which is a scene from his canonical opera Dido and Aeneas. Okay. Now, it's interesting to note, by the way, that the key signature is completely the same as far as Dido's Lament concerned. These are both in the key of G minor. Okay, and moving on to the next layer up, we have in the red the string lines, which are exemplified with a period of tonality at the halfway point over here, surrounded by contrasting glissandi operations. So all 5 of these layers, by the way, I'm going to go more into depth as part of this presentation. That will be the bulk of the presentation. Turning our attention to this area of tonality here, we can clearly see 2 moments of this 3-2-1 scalar descent. However, the first moment ends with a 5-1 cadence here in G minor, while the second moment down an octave is denied this authentic cadence with a pedal in the cellos and the basses on this open G-C chord. So again, this is one of the prominent instances where the pitch C serves as both a musical marker and an anchor, just as the endings of all 3 of these movements did. And we'll keep an eye on this, of course. Okay, moving on to the next layer up, we have in the light blue is the harmony derived from the Passacaglia itself. So as we can see from the orchestration, it begins with brass, then woodwinds and strings, then woodwinds again, and then finally back to the brass. So if we were to assign like letter names to the orchestrational form in this light blue layer, it would simply be A, B, C, B, A. And this is a classic arch form. And this appears actually in another movement, in another guise. So it's interesting to see how some forms of traditional symphonic practice do make their way into the piece, but not in the traditional ways. Here she does it with orchestration. Continuing our journey up the layers, we have next this green layer of omnipresent, what I call minor second temporal glissandi, played only by the woodwind family of the orchestra. So later in the presentation, I will discuss what this means. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time on it right now. Just know that it continues throughout almost the entire movement. Then we get perhaps to the most salient letter, the top layer here in purple, which embodies the various guises of the melodic component of Purcell's Dido's Lament. So the R in this case stands for retrograde, this yellow R, while if you keep going down the purple to this Q, the Q stands for quotation here towards the golden section of the work. So the quote itself of Dido's Lament is revealed or illuminated, we could say, at the golden section of the work here. And I will talk about this more as we go along. So going down to the second movement over here, again, starting from the bottom layer, there are these consistent instances of what I call tremolo percussion in this kind of dark purple color, and pulsing percussion, which is in this blue color. And both of these kinds of percussion modes are performed by a large amount of instruments like the timpani, snare drum, field drum, bass drum, tempo blocks, bongos, gongs, cymbals, glockenspiel, orchestral bells, xylophone. I mean, really the kitchen sink of orchestral percussion. She is using these two modes way more often in this movement than the outer movement in terms of how percussion fits into the form of the piece. Um, Now, the next layer up in brown are these four moments of fortissimo tutti passages, which borrow their rhythms directly from the percussive elements that I just showed you below. Okay, and in terms of pitch content, this movement contrasts sharply with the largely G minor-esque aria from the first movement, with the prevalence of this Tcherepnin 9-note scale that's shown here on the right. So to my ears, and you can see this from the pitch collection itself, that it's kind of like a quasi-octatonic scale, though if you want to describe it in more theoretical terms, it's a scale that's comprised of three conjunct semitone, whole tone, semitone tetrachords. But you know, for simplicity's sake, to probably to most of our ears, it sounds very much like an octatonic scale with an extra note added. And for Coates, the use of the scale actually is more than just that she likes the scale. It's the inventor of the scale, Alexander Tcherepnin, was one of her earliest composition mentors. So it's a very personal thing for her to use this scale throughout, especially the second and the third movements. Moving on to the next layer up, okay, we see the red strings music with the green woodwind music. So I decided to put them in the same layer up here at the top. And you'll see that there are also two distinct modes of transmission here. We have these tremolandi texture in the strings and the woodwinds, and we also have glissandi textures throughout. And in terms of the formal aspects, it's salient to mention that the beginning strings descend in these minor seventh dyads that resolve later on near the golden section of the piece again to this chromatic descent in both the strings and the woodwinds down to F. So you see here, you have these minor seventh dyads going down the strings, tremolando, and then to me, they kind of resolve down here in a chromatic fashion. And then the tutti takes over for the rest of the piece. And finally, with the third movement, if starting as we did before with the lowest layer, right here, with the arrow here, I decided to divide my analysis of the strings in this movement in three parts. The violins are in magenta, and by the way, in this piece there are not just first violin and second violin. There's first, second, and third violin. She divided it into three. And then in the red we have this viola layer, and then the cellos and the basses are in this plum color. So all three of these families of strings function in the same way throughout the entire piece here. And more so than the other movements, I would say, the strings fully encapsulate the agitative sonority of gradually overlapping cluster glissandi, only to resolve at a momentary resting anchor of the perfect fifth right here, much like its occurrence in the halfway point up here in the first movement, as I was talking about. And then from this point till the end, the glissandi take on this like very wobbly sensation. In other words, glissing with extreme vibrato. So if I were to sing it, the regular glissandi we all know is, but then these kind of wobbly glissandi going down. So this is the kind of different sensation she's doing at the halfway point here. And, you know, in terms of the chiaro versus the scuro, to me, the strings here are the exemplification of the scuro aspect of chiaro versus scuro. And interestingly as well, there's a moment here that is completely in the chiaro, which I will go over fairly soon. But there is this kind of always this kind of thing of, okay, is there a chiaro or is there a scuro happening at this moment, and which one is taking more importance in that moment? I think it's a very salient thing throughout the entire symphony, not just in the first movement. And then going up another layer, we have this purple, another purple layer, just like as we did from the first movement. But we'll see that this purple layer represents, uh, instead of, it is a melody, just like the purple layer from the first movement, but this melody is quite different. It is mostly contrasting contrapuntal lines based out of her teacher's 9-note scale. And we see that happening both in disjunct and conjunct ways, okay? And the interesting thing about this is we can really see her affinity for the arch form, because as I mentioned with the harmony up here, this actually takes on an arch form as well. Within the purple contrapuntal lines, we have disjunct, and then we have conjunct, 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 and then we have disjunct again. So it's sort of like this ABA arch form kind of thing happening with the disjunct versus conjunct version of these Tcherepnin scalar melodies. So I think that's quite interesting to point out. The next layer I want to point out is this yellow layer, which provides an extreme contrast to the purple contrapuntal melodies, with these overlapping 30-second note ostinati, which get more and more dense over the span of its 3 iterations in the middle of this movement. So you can see it only happens 3 times, but as we go on, we see it gets more and more dense. You have these bass clarinet trombone with these low frequencies, then clarinets and glockenspiel, higher frequencies, and then you see this third iteration, piccolo, flute, oboe, bass clarinet, trombone, glock, xylophone. You have everything. You basically have the highs and the low frequencies represented here. And then finally, to this last layer that I want to talk about here in this form map, this light blue harmonic layer returns. So we had this light blue harmonic layer here, but now it returns in this way here in the form of these very hushed modal chords by the woodwinds and the brass, and they sing over this widely dispersed CG perfect fifth interval on the string. So to me, this moment in the entire symphony represents probably the most sustained glimmer of optimism in terms of affect, as well as a musical nod to pre-tonal modality of the Renaissance vocal music. So it's almost to me like a harmonic nod to what she was paraphrasing in the first movement, the Dido's Lament. So I'm going to go ahead and play you what this section here sounds like. All right, and one final kind of note to bookend this form map, just to give you a global sense of what's going on. I always like to compare things to traditional. I mean, when I'm talking about a symphony, especially traditional symphonic practice. And now that we've gotten kind of an overview of what happens in this piece from like a very theoretical standpoint, I can't think of Haydn's symphony. I can only think of Haydn's Symphony Number 26 actually when analyzing the work. This symphony has many characteristics which Coates seems to allude to throughout the general form of the work. I mean, although I don't have any direct evidence from the composer to back this claim, I have a few, I believe I have 3 kind of distinct reasons for this. So number one, on a surface level, this is this Haydn Symphony, the 26, is in 3 movements. Okay, as I was mentioning before, another, and the Haydn symphonies actually, he only has 14 out of his 104 symphonies that are in 3 movements, and many of them are many of those 14 are in his first 30 symphonies. So this is a very early kind of rendering, this 3-movement symphony, which kind of comes out of the whole concerto and concerto grosso form, which was always in three movements and still continues to be in three movements. So that's number one. That's more on the surface level. Number two, getting a little bit deeper, the Haydn 26 was the first symphony written in minor mode. The first Haydn symphony, I should say, written in minor mode. The first 25, all in major mode. And in this case, Haydn wrote his 26th symphony in the key of D minor. And here, in the first movement especially, Coates uses the closely related key of G minor. Okay, so that's number two. And number three, and definitely the most salient, I would say. The other two are more on the surface level. Haydn paraphrases in his symphony an assortment of plain chants derived from the Easter celebrations, most notably a piece called A Lamentation of Jeremiah. So curiously, again, as I was mentioning, this parallels the idea of Coates using Dido's Lament in the first movement. So it's just interesting for me. I don't know whether it's something she thought of or had in mind, but it's something I definitely want to ask her, soon. All right. So moving on to, you should have the form map just open, just as a reference. But I'm going to move on to more specific things right now. So one of the compositional techniques I want to talk about in the first movement here, illumination, is that of the paraphrase technique, which was popular particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries, whereby a pre-existing melody is used in a polyphonic work and be subjected to rhythmic and melodic ornamentation, though not obscured. Okay. So I went ahead and I wanted to find some scholarship on this paraphrase technique. And there's actually this very interesting article by Irving Gott, which is in your handout. I put the 2 pages from the article in your handout, but I have also listed a lot of these techniques here. So he lists a bunch of these techniques that he calls them known and unknown methods of Renaissance style paraphrase technique. So I have 30 known methods listed here, which Gott talks about, but he also says, oh, there might be a bunch of unknown methods as well that I haven't listed, which I will add a few of my own actually as we go along in terms of these unknown methods. Okay, so in the yellow, in the highlighted yellow, we see all the ones that Coates used in her first movement of the symphony, and we have this idea of congruence, which is just a fancy way of saying, note for note correspondence between the model, which is the chant, and its derivative, which would be the composition itself, without any rhythmic differentiation. It's basically a quotation. Okay. Then number 7, we have functional extension or elaboration of a note of the model. So if something is, if only one or of the pitches are extended out, this would be what we would call a functional extension. And then going on, we have a bunch of others. So we have number 14, simultaneous paraphrase, which is basically the chant and imitation. And this occurs in the piece as well. We have augmentation, a very common technique, not just for paraphrase, but for, and just in general compositional practice, the idea of taking something that you did before in a piece and then just making the notes longer throughout the duration of the piece. Obviously very common compositional technique in general. Then number 18, kind of a strange one. This one is luxuriant ornamentation. He doesn't really explain this one at all, but I took liberties myself to define what I think this could mean in the context of a paraphrase technique. Then number 21, another very just a general compositional technique, but you can also say it's a paraphrase technique, the repetition of a phrase or a motive. So that's pretty, self-explanatory. Number 24, goes without saying, you can combine these techniques with each other. So you don't just need one of these techniques. You can put several of these techniques together. Okay. Number 27, another very common, just general compositional technique, but very common as well when paraphrasing, the idea of retrograde, the idea of just, starting from the back and making your way forwards in the actual rendering of the paraphrase. And then number 30, which also I kind of took liberty in the way I defined it, intervallic distortion. To me, this means that let's say that you have a paraphrase and the first interval in the paraphrase is a perfect fourth. But then you decide, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to start it not with a perfect fourth, but let's say a minor third. But then everything else is the same. So to me, this is what intervallic distortion could possibly mean. And I'll show you more specific examples as we go along. Okay. Now, in terms of the overall affect, I want to talk about here before I go on to the specific examples. The overall affect of why would she use these paraphrase techniques in the first place? I think that there's a sensation of playing with memory. Okay, and with the subtitle of the movement, illumination. I mean, you can't help but think this as well. And as you can see, even from the form map, if you take a look at the form map, this is further evidence for this, because in the first 2/3 of the piece, you have this kind of it's kind of this blurring effect with the paraphrase technique. We have these retrograde things happening mostly, and then at the golden section of the piece, we actually have the quotation. So to me, it's this is the general affect. We're trying to play with the memory. Okay, I know this this lament, this melody from somewhere. What is it? What is it? You might be thinking throughout the first 7 minutes, and then boom, at the 7-8 minute mark, you discover that, oh, this is if you know Dido's lament, of course, but if you know the piece, oh wow, this is the Dido's lament, and then maybe you would kind of glean that, oh, all those other melodies I heard before were attributed to that. So this is kind of a common trope, of course, in terms of how we use memory in a piece, but it's interesting because she uses it in the guise of the paraphrase technique. So something to point out. So what I'm going to do now is actually go through the different layers of the first movement and show how these different layers show these paraphrase technique in action. So here we go with the first example here. So you'll see this actually in the bottom part of your map. This is the Passacaglia. So you'll see here that I have the two versions. I have the Purcell, and then I have the Coates. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually play you some music. I'll play you the Purcell Passacaglia. Okay, and then now when you hear the Coates, there are a few things I want you to think about while you're listening to the Coates. Number one, there is this congruence here. So as you can see from the staff, they match exactly, even in terms of notation. You have the G, G, F sharp, here G flat, F natural, E, E, E flat, etc. Right? It's a congruence, note for note correspondence. But then we have this augmentation simply because the Purcell is half note equals 60, and then the Coates is here quarter equals 60. Okay, so there is this augmentation going on, a direct 2-to-1 augmentation. And then here in the brackets is my kind of unknown method, according to Gott, this metrical displacement, meaning that now you have these notes in the Passacaglia on different beats. So for example, if we look at the E, right, these are both on the downbeat. But then if you look at the very next note, the E flat, in the Purcell, you see it on the upbeat, and then the Coates, it's on a downbeat. So you get this different metrical idea. These stresses are different between the two pieces. So this helps to kind of blur the line, so to speak, between these two forms of the Passacaglia. So here's the Coates for you. Great. All right, moving on to the next layer here. Make sure I click this here. So now we have, if we look at the form map again, you go up to the harmony layer, the blue layer in the first movement. This is where this comes from. So again, we have here 4 now different paraphrase techniques. Number 1, we have this augmentation, of course, because the speeds are again this 2-to-1 ratio going on here. And then we have this idea of luxuriant ornamentation. I'll talk about this. This one is kind of might be stretching it, but I heard it, so I thought to include it. And then we have the harmonic borrowing. So this is another one that I kind of made up here, the unknown method, so to speak. She actually uses the harmony from Dido's Lament, and actually the voicing is exactly the same too. And I have here the Roman numerals from the Lament as well. And then, of course, because this is 3-2 versus 4-4, the same kind of metrical displacement that occurred in the last slide, we have we need to also include metrical displacement. Okay, so now this is the kind of tricky part. Okay, so this grand staff down here, okay, this is the brass music. Okay, there are other things going on. There's strings, woodwinds, music, but this is the main thing, the brass. Now, this line over here is not in the Coates piece. This is a superimposed sine wave, okay, that I put on top of the harmony to see how well the melodic line would match with the harmony on top. So just to keep this in mind, when you hear this, this is not your your audio crackling. This is a sine. This is going to be just a sine wave that I superimpose on top of the orchestration. And when you hear this, this is when the number 18, the luxuriant ornamentation, comes through. To me, and again, this might be a stretch, to me, the various glissandi that you hear throughout the texture actually are ornamenting this kind of ghost melody that's occurring above the harmony. So even though the melody doesn't exist in the actual piece at this moment, to me, it's almost like, if we heard the melody there, the glissandi would definitely be ornamenting it during the course of these few bars. So, this is just my personal way of hearing it. So here we go. This is this excerpt. Okay, so this is the harmonic layer. So the next one here is how the rhythm is paraphrased in the first movement. So we have here the top layer here. This is the original Purcell, remember me, and repeat it again here, remember me. Now, if we take a look again at these methods of paraphrase at the bottom here, I have 4 of them written down here. So first, what I want to do is actually play you the Purcell, okay? So here's the Purcell. And then if we take the second example here, the clarinet, bassoon, contrabassoon line, we could see that this is a perfect retrograde of this line here. And we definitely know this is from the Dido's Lament, because here she repeats it just like she does, or just like Henry Purcell does in his version. And then we can even see another layer in this third example. We get an additional thing. So now we get 2 extra things. So we had augmentation, we had retrograde. That was in this second example. Now we get 2 other techniques. We have functional extension, which basically means that one of the notes is elongated, or prolonged. So for example, if we take a look at the arrows here, we see the thick side of the arrows are these long notes, right? But at the thin side of the arrow, we have a very short note, okay? Now you look at the thin side of the arrow here, it's a long note. So to me, this is an example of functional extension or functional elaboration. Now the extra kind of caveat here is the simultaneous paraphrase, otherwise known as several voices in imitation. So whereas in the second example, it's more of a direct paraphrase, right? It's just augmented and retrograded, very simple. But here we have these voices in imitation. So I'm going to play you what this sounds like. Bear in mind that the clarinet sounds way softer than the trumpet in this recording. So don't be alarmed if you don't hear these things, but they're definitely there somewhere. Okay, here we go. All right, so we covered the bass line, we covered the harmony, we covered the rhythm. Now we are going to cover probably the most salient part, the melodies, the various melodies that she borrows from Dido's Lament. So again, this is in that purple layer in your form map, okay? So here we're going to talk about the main melody here. When I am laid in earth, may my wrongs create no trouble in thy breast. So this is the famous line from Dido's Lament. So I'm going to go ahead and play you that, the original version. And then if we compare that to the trumpet line here, the first trumpet line here, we can see, again, augmentation, retrograde, metrical displacement. These are things that, are recurring techniques that she uses throughout many of these layers. But then we have this other interesting thing, the intervallic distortion. And you'll see that here we have an A in the Purcell, but then in the trumpet line, we have a B flat. So if this was going to be, an exact paraphrase, this note should have been an A, technically speaking. But because of the harmony that's underneath, she had a little bit of creative license and changed that note to a B flat. So it's kind of remarkable because throughout the piece, she doesn't really do any of this. She doesn't really change any of the intervals that much. But in this instance, she did. So it's for that reason, I want to point that out. So that's one of the techniques, this intervallic distortion, even though it might seem like a kind of ancillary one, especially because it's at the beginning of the phrase. And the other thing to realize is, I'm guessing you've already gleaned from seeing the map, but you'll see that I mapped the different parts of the phrases. So the red here is at the end here in the Purcell, but then the red is in the beginning, and it goes kind of just follows the colors of the rainbow there in terms of how you can track the retrograde of these of the trumpet part in the Coates. So that is one way she uses the melody. And then, sorry. So now I'm going to play what this sounds like here in the trumpet part. All right, and then we have kind of the okay, I click out here. Okay, and then we have like kind of the B theme of the Daedalus Lament here. So we actually have another example of that. Again, augmentation, retrograde, metrical displacement. These are the same techniques she's been using throughout. And again, I have these rainbow colors to demonstrate, especially how the retrograde works, since this is a very long melody here. So here we go with the Purcell. And again, interesting to note, because if you look at your form map, this part here, you see it's measure 3. This is in the very beginning. And instead of doing the "when I am laid" portion of the melody, which is the first thing you hear when you actually hear Dido's lament, you hear the "but ah, forget my fate," which is the B theme of the melody. So it's interesting that the Coates is starting with this melody instead of "when I am laid," because to me it even further helps to blur blur the memory, so to speak, so that when you hear the actual quotation in the next slide, you really are kind of, you feel like, okay, I figured out what even happened from the beginning. Okay, so here is that rendering here, the clarinet bassoons, contrabassoons from measure 3. Okay. Yeah, and it's Hannah Dennis. Yeah, thank you, Hannah. Yeah, that's the singer. Yeah, if you can search it on YouTube, you can search it on YouTube as well. It's actually the period version, so everything is down, about half a tone. Okay, in her version of the Dido's Laments. Hence why I had to use the sine wave. Okay. Now we move on to the actual quotation of the Dido's Lament. So I'm not even going to explain too much, because here we can clearly see that we have a congruence here. We actually have the quotation as it is in the piece, but of course we always have this augmentation and metrical displacement, because the whole piece is in 4/4, 9/3/2. Okay, so here we go. And I'm not going to play the rest of that, because you can just kind of fill in the dots there of how that all ends up in the piece. But it's just a straight up quotation all the way to the end here in these 4 systems. Okay, so again, as I was saying before, this moment occurs during the golden section. We finally hear the quotation in its full bloom, and we finally are kind of illuminated, so to speak, as the subtitle of the movement shows. Now, there's another kind of technique that she uses. All right, so there is another kind of aspect of it, and this is definitely part of the scuro, part of the chiaroscuro. So to me, the paraphrase, the harmony, the tonality, that's all part of the chiaro part of the chiaroscuro. Here we're going to talk about more of the scuro part of this first. Again, we're here again still in the first movement, and here we're focusing our attention on this green layer. So in your form map, you see the green layer. It says this funny little thing, minor second temporal glissandi in the woodwind. So I'm going to explain a little bit about what this is. So you see 2 systems, right, starting from measure 7. And actually, if you look at what I have here in the orange down here, it says etc. with octave displacement until measure 123, which is 11 bars before the end of the movement. So this pattern of diminished fourth cluster, see I have a reduction here of what this is, continues down, 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 in this almost like shepherd tone-esque way, all the way to the end of the entire movement. So this goes on for about 9 minutes in this kind of way. And you'll see that there are these distinct layers. You have this piccolo going down on the downbeat, then the clarinet on the second beat. Then you have this really dark oboe sound on the end of two right here in the second measure. And you'll see this is like a 3 to 4 measure phrase that's repeated, more or less repeated in this kind of fashion all the way to the end of the piece. Now, if you look at the score, it's not literally like this. Sometimes the piccolo takes a break, sometimes the oboes take a break, sometimes the clarinet takes a break in this. But the kind of in our mind, we know that this is what this is in the piece throughout the movement. We know what this high woodwind material serves. We know what it means as we hear it throughout the movement. We don't really need to hear it as literally as it is here. So I don't have, if you see the score and keep flipping through it, you'll see that at the top of the score, where the woodwinds are, you'll see that it's not always this exact rendering. Sometimes it's just the piccolo and the clarinet, sometimes it's the clarinet and the oboe, etc. But you still get this kind of this unit that always is repeating and going down by a semitone. So what I found in the literature is that this is a phenomenon called a temporal semiotic unit, which is a form that conveys meaning through the dynamic evolution of their pattern over time. They're based on a listening attitude that focuses neither on the pitch of a note nor on the musical harmony or timbre of sounds, but on the overall effect of all these parameters over time, just like I've been describing. They cannot be divided into smaller parts that would convey meaning. So for example, if you just had one of these layers, you wouldn't know that this is what this unit is describing. And there are a bunch of these. I believe there are 19 of these kinds of units that you can have in a piece. And you can even have them in you can have them in Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn. You can find different kinds of these temporal semiotic units in the canon, not just in 20th century, 21st century music. And in your handout, if you want to see more about this, read more about this, I put a couple of pages from there if you want to dive more into that. But it's pretty interesting. The unit that I found out that this was the endless trajectory. So you can see, I'm just kind of gonna summarize it for you here. It's a one-phase unit that slowly evolves over time. And then you have this other element that it needs to be orientated in one direction or the other, either up or down, and yet seems to never end. And so as we can see, this is always going down. So that checks that box. And the last thing they say is that the sound phenomenon must be long enough to be perceived as a process and not an ephemeral event. So in other words, it doesn't just show up once and that's it. It needs to continue on throughout the piece. It's a very kind of, it was post-minimal before we had post-minimalism in a way. So this is what that sounds like. And I just left you off here, so you can imagine this kind of thing continues all throughout the movement, going down by a semitone. It's a very long process to get to the end in this way. Okay, so that was the green layer, the minor second temporal glissandi. Okay, now if we go to the next layer here, the strings. This is the strings red layer in your form map in the first movement. We can see that microtonality is definitely serving not just a formal function as we saw with the temporal glissandi, right? But it's also in a very textural component. So we can see in this very first section in the green here in the first system, we start off with a major third octave displaced cluster in root position. So you see C, D, E. It kind of makes you think, okay, this is sort of going to be in the C major sort of thing, and you can't help but think about this further because in measure 17 you see the cluster change to GAB major third, displaced cluster in first inversion. You have the B on the bottom, so you can't help but think, oh, this might be in C major in some strange way. And then you have these plus and minus notation here, which just means that you're going up by a quarter tone and then down by a quarter tone in respect to the indicated pitch. So for example, we have C and then C quarter sharp. And then here, this would be C quarter flat and then C quarter sharp, etc. So that's what's happening here, for example. So you have this kind of thing. So I will go ahead and have you guys hear what this sounds like. All right, and that continues on all the way to measure 21, where we have this new texture in the strings. Now, at first glance, it kind of just looks like a bunch of glissandi going down, right? Which is what it is. But if you compare it to the slide before, the temporal glissandi and the woodwinds, actually there are a lot of similarities. So these glissandi span intervals of perfect fourth, tritones, perfect fifth, sixth. So if you look just at one line, for example, we have A flat to E flat, perfect fourth, G to D flat, tritone, G to C, perfect fifth, G to B, minor sixth, etc. We have these intervals that are always spanning between a perfect fourth and a minor sixth. Whereas in the woodwind version, actually these clusters were in the interval right below perfect fourth, at the diminished fourth. So to me, it's kind of interesting that she's expanding on these glissandi with the string lines here in measure 21 onto measure 26. So to me, I call this a temporal augmentation of the woodwind glissandi line. That's what I like to call it, at least. So here is what that sounds like. Okay, so again, we're even getting more of a blur, right? We're getting more of a blur as far as the string texture goes. Here, we can see that it's very methodical, right? It's every single beat. We know we're going up by a quarter tone. As we can see, all these are pluses, and the next beat going down a quarter tone. But here, they're all overlapping, and they're all going down with various intervals. They're not always perfect fourths all the way down. Sometimes they're tritones, sometimes they're perfect fourths, etc. It's more of a blurring effect that occurs. And then I would even argue that at 36, we even have a further blurring effect with this now expanded white note cluster. We have G, A, B, C, right? So it's akin to what's happening here in the CDE and the GAB. It's kind of combined, and they're dispersed in this kind of A minor 9 root position chord. But the important thing to note is that whereas these are very clearly defined areas of music, right? Everything is notated. Here we have these very improvisatory stretches of music happening. You have these kind of rises and falls that are overlapping, and we don't really quite know where is the highest note. I mean, it kind of looks like a G here in the first violin, but we don't really know. It could be G sharp. We don't really know. So there is this kind of improvisatory aspect that further blurs what's happening in the music. So this is what that sounds like. And this continues on. You'll see another system of this. And then all of a sudden, and you'll see this in your form map around the 4-minute mark, you'll see this. We all of a sudden get this area of chiaro, okay? All the scuro, and then and then an area of chiaro. To me, it's kind of like if you look at my second or third slide, the Caravaggio painting, you see this kind of light coming in from the right-hand side of the painting, and this to me reminds me a lot of that. Kind of all this kind of light that all of a sudden shows up in the image. And you can see here in orange, I labeled these orange chords are labeled thus because these, to me, they sound much more modal than functional. And the black Roman numerals are all the functional chords in G minor, that is to say. So here's what that sounds like, starting from measure 48. Okay, and that continues on, and we see, if you look at the bass line, again, we haven't stopped doing the Passacaglia, right? We have the bass line continuing: F, E natural, E flat, D, B flat, C, D, D, G, right? So this is the exact same Passacaglia, but now it's handed over to the string line. Then at 63, to me, this is a new texture, of course, but to me, this is the clearest way that I think that Coates is able to put the chiaro and the scuro right at each other in one family of instruments. I believe this is the only time that this actually happens in this movement. You have the glissandi from this F6, F major 6 chord, glissing down to this open C, this famous open C G chord that I mentioned earlier on in the talk. But at the same time, you have this octave melody happening in the inner voices that's kind of obscured by this scuro, very long glissandi. Okay, so and then we get this really interesting thing. So I've been talking about mostly white note clusters. Here we have a perfect fourth cluster that is totally chromatic. So again, I was mentioning earlier in the talk that there are these very clear 3-2-1 tonal elements in the string writing. But here we have this 3-2-1. This would be your lower octave 3-2-1 if you're following along on the map, the second time this happens. But instead of having this, like, for example, 1-2-5-1 traditional cadence, what you have is this really, really completely scuro, the perfect fourth cluster that occurs right before this F sharp G, what we think should be a 5-1 cadence. But what ends up happening is all of this is happening over pedal C. So it completely obscures where we think we're going. So it's a very, what I'm describing is a very, traditional. This is nothing new. This is very traditional in especially in Western classical pre 20th century music. But you are not used to kind of hearing these kind of expectations of a chiaro, for example, in the middle of all these glissandi, all these scuro moments. So I'm going to go ahead and play you from 63 all the way to the end of the system, so you can really get a chance to hear how these two elements collide. Okay, so this is my personal favorite part of the piece because of these these very clear clashes between the chiaro and the scuro. I mean, to me, it's I'm personally, for me, that's my favorite part of the piece. So that's all there is to that. Now we'll see here. This is the kind of final layer of the or the final part, I should say, of how she uses microtonality in the string part. So now you can see that this is much more dynamic than all the other ways that she used the glissandi, most especially because we have these very random, static pitches. We have a B natural, B flat, static, glissandi down, glissandi up, but this one's longer than this one. You have F sharp, you have F natural, you have G, then you have all. So basically what I'm trying to say is you have all these very dispersed clusters that are going on throughout this entire section. And if you look at your form map, this is also the longest part of the string line. If you look, this starts around the 6-minute mark. I have written here overlapping asynchronous gradual glissandi and static pitches. So definitely probably one of the more scuro parts because it's completely blurred and you don't really know where the string line is going. But at the same time, you have to realize that the quotation for "when I am laid" is happening at the same time. So you have this element of the chiaro in the paraphrase, but at the same time, a very deep, dark scuro happening in the string line. So here's what a bit of that sounds like. And then you'll see, you're going to see the next slide. It's basically kind of the same thing also, but although you see it kind of constricting, you see that some of the intervals are getting wider and then the temporality is getting more constricted. That's probably the biggest difference that you see. The ranges are getting also more exaggerated as we get towards the end of the piece. Then I should also point out that finally we get our 5 chord here. We have a 5 chord in G minor. We have our D and our F sharp. But as you can expect, it does not get resolved. So we have another famous white note cluster chord, D. You have E, D, and G, but then this glisses out to our octave C. So, and then you can see here, this is the general, string form copied from the form map. Okay, so in conclusion, I want to say, Coates was able to produce a kind of homage to the visual arts of the Renaissance through her musical depiction of both its chiaro and scuro gradations, using both tonality and microtonality in broad as well as fine strokes. Curiously, Coates herself is an avid visual artist herself and created the cover art for the CD that the Fourth Symphony appears on. I believe that the symphony should be given more chances to secure a place in the 20th century symphonic repertoire, as its emotional breadth and sheer inventive spirit reflect the highest ideals in what can be possible in a large, expansive orchestral setting. I will leave the last word to Coates herself, who in this YouTube video from New Music Box back in 2008 briefly explains how her painting relates to her composing practice.
Composing was much more detailed, it took a different part of my expression. The art, my painting, I could do it much more quickly because visually what I saw in my thoughts and my form and structure, I could see and I could do it very quickly. And the details which one sees on this, if we take a contrapuntal part, it would be here, and there's always a counterpoint, and I think this expression one could do very quickly. Whereas to put all of those notes down and to figure out the notation, it takes much, much longer, and perhaps it goes to another part of myself. This type of expression has a loosening effect for me. It had on the other part, because I could think, I could see, yes, I would not do the same thing in the music, but here it is. And then it would give me courage for the long, long time that it would take to do the musical compositions.